All right, so my friends, welcome to BridgeWay Podcast Episode 2. And what are we talking about today? Well, Bear decided to skip town and go to Switzerland and, asked me if I would, clean up and finish up the series on marriage. So I said, okay, I'll try. I don't have, half as much time in my marriage as some of the people who were talking last week, and maybe, 10% of you put all those 3 marriages together. But I'm happy to talk about all the ways that I've learned from failure, maybe a few good choices. But I figured there's no way that I was going to be able to do this by myself. So I figured, let me reach out and see if the most important person in the whole world is available to be our guest this week. So I'm not sure if you realize this, but we have the most important person in the whole world on our podcast this week. It's kind of crazy. So everybody get excited. And let's give a BridgeWay welcome to the most important person in the world, Sherri Bankston. Come on. Yeah. So I guess perspective matters in this case, but all right. Well, Sherri Bankston, welcome to the BridgeWay podcast.
Thank you.
So go ahead and get settled in here, and as usual, we want to get started here and get a little bit of background. Thankfully, I think most people here probably know who you are. So why don't you just give them a little bit of a background about who we are and where we come from here.
All right. We have been together since 2004, married since 2006, and have 3 kids. But some background to that, I would say we both come from nuclear homes, and the fact that we've both been blessed to have parents that have been married a really long time. We just celebrated my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, so we had great examples in our lives, like Julianne and Nick had said, from both positive and things that we learned and didn't want to take into our marriage, but for the most part, amazing influences in our life. Before we were married, we both loved the Lord and loved Jesus, and that was something that was very important to us in finding a spouse. So we were blessed to be equally yoked when we wed, and then finally, we didn't get to date each other very much because if you didn't know it, my husband is in the military, and when we started dating, he lived in Annapolis, and I was in Dallas, Texas. And then he floated all around the U.S., and I was still at home in Texas. So that didn't allow for much dating in person. However, we spent many, many, many dimes in the back of the day when you had to pay per minute on our cell phone bills.
We're not that old. All right, yes. So this episode that we're going to do today, I would like for you to tell everybody, please, what this is not going to be, what we are not going to talk about.
Yeah, when he asked me to do this, I said yes and then regretted it immediately. Only because it was very important to me that we didn't sit up here and try to say, oh, do it like us because we're amazing. You should do it just like this. No. I don't think you'll ever find any perfect marriage out there, and ours certainly is not an example of that.
Oh, come on. Everybody here believes that we have a perfect marriage, right?
Yeah. Also, this is not self-help hour, Dr. Phil, Oprah. I get frustrated with churches that sit up there and be like, well, if you just follow this 7-step plan, you're going to be all fixed. And if you're not following this plan, you must be failing somewhere. It's your fault. That is not this. We hope to get deep into the Word and use that as our ultimate guide, and God is our authority, and that is the guide, recognizing that we are going to fail in those places, but He forgives us every time and uses that to grow us closer to Him.
Yeah, so ideally, we spend some time talking about what the Word says and maybe tell you some stories, but we ultimately want to point everybody's relationships back to Christ. And so, disclaimer, this is not just a marriage talk. It's not just for marriages, because marriage is really just the platform where, we experience growth together in Christ-likeness and fruitfulness, but these lessons point back to relationships in general and to the church. And so we just hope that everybody will consider how some of those truths might relate to the church and one another. So I want to kick it off in the Word today. We're just going to go back to the beginning like we like to do every time. So I'm going to ask you to read for us. If you'll go to Genesis 2, verses 20 and 23, and we're going to try to talk a little bit about God's ideal versus human failure.
2, 20 through 23. So the man gave names to all the livestock and the birds of the air and all the beasts of the field. But for Adam, no suitable helper was found. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. The man said, The man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man."
All right, so I'm hoping maybe I can challenge you today on maybe some the assumptions or the way that you first learned this when you were first reading this. And it just really depends on the manuscript that your translators had whenever they translated the Bible into English. So, we all grew up learning about Adam's rib, and that, this rib came out of him, and all of a sudden we have a woman. And so I just wanted to offer that there are some alternate ways of translating this. Depends on, when you get down to the root of Hebrew. And this word for rib is actually translated as side. And it's not just, the side of a person. It's most often used in the Bible as the side of a building. And then right after that, talking about when the Lord formed Eve, it's a word to use to build up a building. And so I would challenge you to, consider maybe it's not the Lord pulling out a rib, but from one of his sides and then building the woman from one of Adam's sides. So you might even think of it more like he split the human in two, because that's what the word Adam means in the original Hebrew. It just means human. We don't get to man and woman until the Hebrew goes to Ish and Isha, man and woman. And so the Lord split the human in two. So you might say he split the atom. Waka waka. Okay. Anyhow, the point is what I hope everybody gets out of this, that he split the human in two. And so it's the image of one becomes two and then becomes one. And then you see this in the original creation, and then you see it over and over and over again throughout the rest of the Bible, where, two people, they begin as one, they come together as two, but God joins them together in unity as one flesh. So I'm curious, have you ever heard of this translation before, and kind of, how does that sit with you?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
And it sits well for me. Actually, the translation that I had says part, not just a rib, but that she was made from part of him, and the two become one. Hopefully I'm not stealing the thunder, but I love the idea in marriage, the three strands of two people together with Christ become one. And the idea that we are one flesh and that we are of one mind and one spirit if Christ is our focus center. So easily, if he's not, and we try to take it out of that one strand, it doesn't go well for anyone around us. But that doesn't mean that we are always the same.
True. And from our experience, it's kind of strange sometimes, but at the same time not. Sometimes when we're hanging out, I feel like I'm looking at the same person as myself. And it's kind of weird how, where do I end and you begin? And I don't know, but then at the same time, it's really not that strange, because that's how God designed it to be. And so the other thing that, comes from my experience is that I can go on lots of business trips, and it only takes a day or two to realize that, I'm actually a better person when we're together, because, we are supposed to go together, and we do have that unity, and it doesn't work the same when we're not together.
But I would also add that we're each uniquely made. We are not the same person. We don't even like the same things. For example, he's an Astros fan, and I'm a Rangers fan, and yet we can still live together. But on a more serious note, like the church, like the body of Christ, we all have our parts to play. He gifts us all with amazing gifts and talents, and where there are things that we share, like we love to sing and have been gifted with the ability to sing and praises to the Lord together. There's things that he's really great at, like listening. Right. And that is something I've had to learn how to do. I think that we've both been skilled in being able to lead others, but there are other things that he's extremely great at, and I am terrible at, like going outside.
Yeah, so this kind of just goes back to the image of God, how, each of us can individually be the image of God, but we don't fully image the Lord until we have that union together. And that's the same thing in marriage, and that's the same thing here in the church, and it's really all of humanity together. So as humanity keeps growing, we are more fully imaging the Lord. Now it's a bit failed and flawed in the way that we image the Lord, but that is the way that he designed it. All right, so that's the first challenge of translating Genesis. Let's go to the next one. Let's go to Genesis 3, verses 15 and 16.
Yes. I often have to remind myself that even if Eve had not fallen, I would have, one of us would have, and would have still brought this on the earth. So can't just get mad at her. Anyway. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to children.
All right, so again, kind of throw out a challenge there for some of the translations, the way this makes it into English. And it says, going to multiply your pain in childbirth or childbearing. And this can, often be seen as the curse of the woman, but this multiply your pain in childbearing, if you go back to the Hebrew again, when we talk about the word childbearing, the way that some of the earliest Hebrew manuscripts talk about that, it's not really the act of birthing a child, but actually the act of conceiving children, bringing children forth. And so we're talking about the acts and the relationships of conception of children. We're just going to keep it nice and real on today's podcast. And so pain, multiply your pain. That word pain also isn't really referring in the Hebrew to physical pain, but more of emotional pain. And so, an alternate translation here that we consider, instead of multiply your pain in childbearing, it'd be more like painful toil in the relationships that lead to the conception of children. And so, thankfully, we've never dealt with that painful toil ever in our life. So we don't really have much to say here on the podcast. But hey, what you do see in the rest of Genesis and the Bible after that is that concept playing out over and over and over again, this painful toil in these relationships of bringing children forth, whether that's infertility or, a few generations after Adam, the first man decides, well, I'm going to deviate from God's plan. I'm going to have more than one wife, as if that was a good idea. And so you see, broken relationship after broken relationship with polygamy, which leads to rivalries, and on down the line to Solomon, who is supposedly the smartest guy of all time, but somehow all his wives led him into idolatry. So we see these broken relationships happen over and over again. Kind of, where does that... How does that different translation compared to what you originally learned?
I mean, it just gives generational evidence of us failing at this intimate relationship, of something that God had deemed good, human tried to destroy and mess up, all because of our own sin or desires or wants, and going all the way back into the beginning of him saying, like, I'm going to allow you to live, but also realize that you're going to have plenty of opportunities to make bad choices. And that's definitely something that we have experienced ourselves, even from the beginning of this toil, or this, what did they say, enmity between you, that is there. I think it's important to point out that this isn't a reason to justify abuse. Some translations see this as, oh, well, I should stay because it's justified here. That is not the case, and not something that either of us would campaign for. So if that's something that you're struggling with, please reach out to someone else for sure.
Yeah. We'll get a little bit more into this topic here in a few minutes, but yeah, obviously, we have had and, still continue to have no shortage of living out this brokenness that's in Genesis 3, and that's just kind of a part of life. But before we get more into that, I want to jump forward to the New Testament in Ephesians 5, and if you can give us a longer passage here, verses 22 through 32. I'm a big fan of just reading the Bible out loud.
And this one we actually read, or had read, at our wedding. All right, 22. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church.
Thank you. So right now, I just want to basically affirm headship of the husband based on what the word says, without stepping on any landmines at the same time. So all I will say is that, in our family, we trust what the word says and we practice headship of a husband. But I think anyone who knows my beloved here knows that she is no doormat. So I'm curious for you, what does that look like living that out in our life together?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. If you know me, I am very much a policy person.
No.
I find somewhat of a peace to have something to fall back on. So if this is our truth, this is what there is to fall back on, of like, if all else fails and I don't know the right answer, and even if I think everything's going to go terribly wrong, I have to trust God's word and what he said. And I think that works out in our relationship as we do everything and make decisions as a team, but sometimes when there's important decisions to be made, even if we've debated it and gone round and round, at the end of the day, I have to trust that he has the best decision plan in mind for me, for our family, for our children. And there's a little bit of comfort in the end sometimes, even if I'm like, this isn't what I would choose and I feel terribly about this. Knowing that in the end, he's the one that has to carry that burden. He has to carry that. And he has saying, I've prayed about it, and this is the word the Lord has led me. And so I have to step out in faith here. And so it's only fair that I trust him and let that happen for our family. With that being said, so often in any of these things, he seeks my, not just my opinion, but I would say any experience or knowledge we share together, we talk about it. There's no just big decisions made off the cuff. And most of the time, I would say like 90% plus, it's a group decision. It is where that has to come to that. However, it's going to happen, and it's okay to release that
Yeah, I think we try to think of it more as a responsibility to each other instead of, who has authority.
Right.
And so, carry the responsibility of having to make tough decisions sometimes. And sometimes I would rather just not make any decision at all. I mean, that never happens in our relationship. But, it makes me think, again, going back to Genesis, about how the Lord built up an Azer for the human. And that's another way where our English translations might come a little bit short when it translated as helper. It kind of makes it sound like something inferior, but, another way you could translate that based on the way that Azer shows up again throughout the rest of the word is almost more like a liberating ally, someone who, works together, and we bring each other to that place that we're trying to get to together. All right, so let's change gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about respect. And as we talk about respect, guess where we're going to go in the Bible next? When you think of respect, everyone thinks Song of Solomon, right? All right. No? Okay. More like love poetry. But hey, let's see where we get. So let's do Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verses 10 and 12, and then we'll do chapter 5, verse 2.
10 and 12. How delightful is your love, my sister, my bride. How much more pleasing is your love than wine, and the fragrance of your perfume than any spice. You are a garden locked up, my sister, my bride. You are a spring enclosed, a sealed fountain. And 5:2. I slept, but my heart was awake. Listen, my lover is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my flawless one. My head is drenched with dew, my hair with the dampness of the night.
So thanks to our sister Lydia last week, who, gave a great message on talking about how in marriage, we are still brothers and sisters. We are brothers and sisters first. And that is something that's easy to forget about. But thankfully, in our time together, it's really helped me to kind of change my perspective, or kind of where my heart is sitting whenever I remember that you're not just, the other half of me, but you are first a precious daughter of God, and you are my sister. And that's something that I have needed reminding of throughout our relationship together, because as we just go day after day after day with each other, it's the reminder that I need is I need to daily approach you with dignity and honor and respect, just like I would want to receive, and because it's so easy to get familiar and lazy with that. I know I have struggled with that. Has that been difficult for you at all?
Knowing that he is handsome is not difficult. But the other stuff, for sure. When you say, it's a duty to God, and I'm so thankful I get to carry it out. Yes, but sometimes it's a duty, right? Women, I don't know if you're like me at all, but we have chores, we have things. Our minds are constantly full of all the things that have to be done that day, all the things that have to be cared for, the people in our house, all the people that are expecting things from you. And when you are with someone in any space, that's all filled up. And so you have to somewhat block that and give someone else your undivided attention, or give someone else not just your attention, but your love and care and kindness. And I think that applies to friendships just as much as it does to intimacy, is that you have to set everything else aside and be willing to talk with others and give them your heart, give them your mind. And at the end of the day, especially if you've had a very full day, that's maybe the last thing that you feel like doing. Maybe you just want to veg. Maybe you just want to go to sleep. And it's really, one more chore? But it's not just a chore. It is a gift that I get to hang out with him every day. It is a gift. And I may not always feel like a gift, but I have to remind myself, and we have to often remind each other, that you're ultimately serving one another as you would serve the Lord. And to treat others how you would want to be treated. And when I have a whole bunch of things I just need to get out and say, and he's like, I just want to go to And he's willing to sacrifice that 5 minutes to let me verbally vomit everywhere, because he knows that he would want to be treated the same. And it's, something that we are blessed to get to do together. Now, we've failed at this, but I've also had to learn that shame gets you nowhere. Repentance and a journey with Christ is everything through this. So you could sit there and perpetuate the problem by going, I've failed. Oh, I'm not good at this. Oh, he's thinking that I failed him again tonight, or tomorrow I'm, not giving him everything that he needs, and he's not being filled. And then you just sit there in this spiral. That's not healthy. It doesn't get us anywhere, and it definitely doesn't get me to loving him better. So repenting of that to Christ and asking him to help me to come back to that.
Yeah. And, talking about giving of yourself to another person, whether, in marriage or in friendship, but, dialing in on marriage here, we go back to the Song of Solomon, and we get to the part where, he's knocking at the door of the garden. He is waiting for her to open up and to let him in. And so you have this picture of, the husband comes and he knocks and he waits. And so he's just taking this risk and he's putting himself out there. And then she gets to choose whether she gives herself or not. And so, some of our Catholic brother and sisters that listen to a podcast who really just got this one talk from one of the popes, I think, talked about, she remains a master of her own mystery. But, where the husband comes and knocks and waits and that risk, I got to say, some people, hypothetically, might think that it's easier to just not knock at all and take no risks and don't even worry about that at all. What would you say to this hypothetical person who decides to, never take risks? Okay.
Not helpful.
And so what would be a better approach instead of just saying, I'm not going to take any risks and I'm not even going to knock?
I mean, the selfish response would be like, am I not worth the risk?
Mm-hmm.
But I think the more loving response is communication on both sides is so helpful. And just because you knock, I can give a response that doesn't necessarily open the door.
Mm-hmm.
But then you know where I'm at, I know where you're at, and we can meet and come together. And it's not necessarily a wistful ask that's unmet.
Right. And I think what you said about communication is probably the most helpful thing for this hypothetical person, because, if you don't knock, then you don't get any response. And so then you just make up the response in your own mind. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like what you were saying about, shame gets you nowhere, and you're worrying about all these things in your mind that aren't actually happening. And so whenever we don't communicate with each other, we just communicate in our own minds and we fill in all the gaps, and it's often not helpful, like you said.
Opens a huge gap for resentment or things like that never had to start to begin with.
Yeah. So I think I would encourage any potential people out there who just don't want to take risks. I would say that it probably gets worse if you don't. And communication is still important.
Yeah, and something I would add to this conversation in general is, in reality, we all bring baggage to relationships. In our case, I think the biggest baggage came in the intimacy arena. We all have things that we have to carry or grow from. I definitely grew up in purity culture that, I don't want to say spread a lot of lies, but definitely some untruths and gave me some false ideas that made it very difficult, conversations or when things were okay now because we're married. It made it very difficult for me to work through. I also was a whistleblower on a sexual child abuse situation in my neighborhood when I was very young, and so there were some mind things, and so I brought that into the marriage, and that's something that he didn't ask for, but that he was willing to take on and deal with.
Yeah, I certainly didn't realize how unhelpful some of that purity culture stuff was until we got farther down the line and realizing kind of how that made us approach some things. And I brought baggage in it as well, in terms of, being a teenager and a young man and dealing with, some of the typical struggles of, falling into pornography, and then just, looking at what the world shows about, how husbands and wives or people who are dating and how they're supposed to interact and how they're supposed to, have expectations of each other. And, if you don't believe that bringing any of that stuff into your marriage is corrosive, then you're just kind of fooling yourself. And so for us, it's having to combat all that baggage together, and understanding that we brought that in, and having to stick together as we work to clean it all out.
Yeah, and I would say if I had to choose one area that God's grown us the most in and like showed us obvious healing, it's that area of marriage altogether than anything else. Like, I can point to it and see him working in our marriage more in that area than
because it's perfect now, right?
Yeah.
No, but I agree.
We do have 3 children.
Immense growth. Now, okay, this is getting uncomfortable. I'm going to move on. All right, so let's talk about unity. We got a little bit of that as we talked about God's ideal at the beginning, but let's drill down on that a little bit. So let's jump back to some more of Paul's letters. Let's do Philippians chapter 2 and verses 3 through 7.
Yeah, New Testament. All right. 3 through 7. Is that right? Yes. No.
It's all good.
No.
I mean, you read something and we'll talk about it. It'll be great.
Okay. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interest, but also to the interest of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness.
So we could talk about this for a couple of hours. I really just want to get some of your take on this. I won't say too much, but choosing to show up every day and trying to practice all this and trying to get it right every day is certainly hard. And I think at the beginning of our relationship, sometimes we think that it's just going to be great all the time because we finally get to be together after being apart for so long. It's going to be amazing. And so our marriage counselor talked to us and even gave us a test to see who had what he called the rose-colored glasses versus a more realistic
This is the
thought.
pastor doing our premarital counseling.
Yeah, and so any guesses who had stronger rose-colored glasses as we went into our marriage? I mean, my score wasn't perfect either, but yeah, I think yours was a little bit more rose-colored. And and then life happened, and we came back to reality. But someday, we'll keep getting a little bit closer to this ideal, and maybe I'll look a little bit more rosy to you. But I want to get your take on this, from Philippians 2, talking about humility versus selfishness.
Yeah, I think marriage is the perfect example of this, but really, like, when he asked me to prepare to this, I started getting into it. I was like, oh man, I could preach on this. And I think the biggest word is sacrifice. It's this idea that you are putting another person above yourself. You're willing to choose discomfort for the other, and it later goes on in Philippians to say, without grumbling and arguing. We just created a behavior plan for one of my children. I'll just say one of my children.
You know who it is.
And willing to do what you're being asked to do, even though you don't want to do it. Showing love and being willing to talk to someone, even when you, quote unquote, don't have the time. Willing to always say, it's not about you. It's not about me. It's about the other person, and I should always be putting that person first. Not because it's like this magic code or some special thing, but because Christ does that for me every day. So who am I to say that I can't do that for my spouse, who I'm saying is the number one most important person on the earth for me? Why would I not do that? sometimes the Lord uses my children to check me, and they'll say, "You're willing to give all this time to this person who you barely know." But sometimes you don't do that, for people that you've known for a long time. And truthfully, you always want to treat someone else like you want to be treated, yes, but also willing to do that even if you're not going to get the same response back. It's this understanding that you're going to put in the work, you're going to make the sacrifice, you're going to make it about that other person, whether you get 100% of that respect or feeling or unity back. I would say that he does a pretty great job of it, but there are some times where I'm sitting there praying, "Lord, I'm doing this because I know it's the right thing to do. Lord, I need your strength. Lord, I need your help. Lord, I'm not feeling it right now." To be honest, we've had hard times sometimes. We're like, "Lord, I don't even like him right now. Please help me to do the right things and put him first, even though the number one thing I want to do is, run away."
Yeah, we'll get into a little bit more of that here in a few minutes, but before we dive deeper into that, let's do 1 Corinthians 13, verse 7. We can't talk about marriage at all and not go to 1 Corinthians 13, right? But hey, we're just going to do one of the verses.
I tried to use this verse for the whole thing, but he only let me do one verse. Okay. 13:7. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres.
Yeah. I didn't think we needed to read all of chapter 13. This isn't a wedding today. But verse 7, it really gets into what we've talked about before, what we learned at one of our old churches, where they said over and over, where love is a verb. And they even thought about making T-shirts that they were going to have available for the congregation that said, "I verbed my wife today." I kid you not. The church was going to do this.
The most profound sermon series, though, on marriage that I've ever, I'm still gleaning from today, and it was a good 15 years ago.
Yeah, and so, all these different verbs where, love manifests, we've, struggled, and then we've grown, and then grown some more. Kind of what areas do you feel like, as far as action and love being a verb, where we've grown a lot?
Yeah, like every marriage thing, secular or Christian, will tell you the top 3 topics that marriages struggle with are finances, communication, and intimacy. I've already told you, by far, one of our biggest growth areas was intimacy, but the second, I would say, is communication, one that we continue to work on, but if that isn't present, you're not really giving yourself any favors to succeed.
Yes, and communication requires skill. It's not just practice and a commitment to it, but there are actual skills in communicating with each other that will bring you more or less success. And we could preach a whole sermon on that one, but I cannot encourage you enough to learn how to communicate with each other better. It is worth your time and effort.
And the biggest skill, if you want one of those steps to take home that helps, when you're in an argument and you're saying things that have hurt your feelings, don't use the word "you." That's one of the biggest ones I've learned and still fervently working on.
So you mean, like, instead of me saying, you didn't help me enough as I was trying to get ready for this podcast, instead I would say, I feel like I'm not getting as much help as I could really use during this time as I'm preparing. Would that be any better?
It would definitely get you a lot closer.
Okay. So, just an example, not a real example. So some other skills that I think you kind of hinted at is pillow talk. And, I think you alluded to, maybe not my favorite, but I think I've become convinced that it's helpful. Why do you think that is?
Well, you could go to the Bible verse that says, "Don't let the sun go down on your anger." However, pillow talk doesn't necessarily have to be anger. Something that we do is before he leaves and goes somewhere or vice versa in the morning, we start our day, with a hug and a kiss. Goodbye, I love you, have a great day. And that goes a long way. And so that starts our day. To end our day that way, to have a time to meet together. Anybody that look at our calendar know that it's too full, that our kids are doing a lot of things. There's so many things going on between us both individually and together that there's so much that happens during that day. So to have time, even if it's 5-10 minutes, to connect about whatever it may be, and not just, okay, who needs to be where tomorrow, but hey, how's your heart? Where are you at? Or this hilarious thing happened today, or you wouldn't believe this guy. Just having a person in your life to be able to do that with makes and ends the day well so that you can start the day well the next day as well.
Yeah, and if you were married to someone who's not really good at that, or, trying to have pillow talk with someone who's not super engaging all the time, how do you go about that?
Start by sitting up, not laying down. Start by sitting up. And, if you need to get real practical about it and set a timer, that's better than nothing. But I think just sitting up, being willing to talk to each other, and maybe even have some prompts that are helpful.
Yes.
Like, how's your heart? What made you laugh today? Is there anything that you're struggling with? Now, we don't ask those same questions every night. But like, did anything funny happen with the kids today? How was work? I know you were working on this big test plan. Did that work out? Just showing each other that we care, but also that I'm actually tracking what he's doing in his life and vice versa.
Yeah, I would say just asking a question can be super helpful. That's inviting me to talk instead of, well, this is the time when we go to bed. I'm waiting for you to talk to me now. Asking a question is very helpful for people who aren't always the best at starting or engaging in conversations. All right, so I want to throw out an encouragement to everybody that, I heard going to church and maybe some other places over and over again, and then, many years later, we finally put it into practice. So maybe we can tick off one of the marks for people here if they're still trying to get there. But I was told so many times, never stop dating your wife. I'm like, what does that even mean? But I will say once we, committed to this, made a huge difference. And just because, we are always going on dates or weekly going on dates doesn't mean that it all falls on me to figure out everything, right? That we can be a team. I don't always have to be the man figuring out everything. I'm going to, be super romantic with you every week. No. What benefit have you seen from that?
So it was a huge benefit. Those 3 areas we talked about, finances, communication, intimacy. When we had a solid babysitter when our kids were younger, and she went to college, and we stopped having those Sunday date nights. It was evident in all 3 of those areas. We thought, we're going to save so much money because we're not paying this babysitter once a week, and we're not purposely going out and spending money on food and purposely spending it out. We spent more money in those months without a babysitter and without taking that dating time than to have that connection each week, having paid the babysitter and the food. And just because that communication wasn't there, but that weekly check-in and that time that's not distracted. Ooh, I talk with my hands. This is really hard. Not having that distraction and really being able to give ourselves to each other in conversation and not thinking about the 800 things that we have going on.
Yeah, so anyone who was at BridgeWay years ago when Jason Bain was going to the church with us, I'll always remember one thing that he said when we were sitting around one day at the old community center. He said, investing in a weekly date with your wife is a much more fruitful investment than any 401k that you could ever pay into. And so I've always remembered that, and we have prioritized based on that just to try to figure out something once a week, even if it ends up being, all right, pray with the kids, y'all go to bed, now it's date night, don't bother us, and we're gonna go we're going to play a board game together. I don't know.
Yeah, and I'll say, like, we've had purposeful date nights sort of set aside and, like, we're going to have a date because this is the right thing to do, and I know I need to, but also, like, grumbling of heart, like, that's the last thing I feel like doing is spending another 3 hours with you because we aren't having a good time together, right? Like, but I don't want to say forcing, but making a commitment to take that time to be together and then likely the next day have a redo of like, okay, we've at least set aside this time. Let's work out whatever it is that is between the two of us. And then the next day or if it has to be a week later, let's redo that.
Thanks for talking about commitment, because that is the last topic that I wanted to get into here. But seriously, it's worth it. Go on weekly dates. Figure it out one way or another. Be creative. Just do it. All right, so let's go back to Genesis again. Let's do Genesis 1:27 and then 2:24.
So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh.
All right, so that's the design from the beginning. Before we talk a little bit more about this, I want to go to Deuteronomy 24 and read verses 1-4.
If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord God is giving you as an inheritance.
All right, so we saw in Genesis what God's design was from the beginning, and then we see here in Deuteronomy 24 that this is God's allowance for the hardness of heart of the Israelites, and that's what Moses is providing here. But I want to make it super clear that, in our relationship, we never use the D word. That's just not an option. That was not a word that we would ever flippantly throw around. I'm curious, what value you see in that.
Yeah, creates safety. It inspires each other to put in the work. It's a commitment that we made before the Lord and before all of our family and friends, and it's something that we have to go back to. So if that's not an option, I'm left to have to figure it out. And I don't have to figure it out alone. I may feel alone, but the Lord is there with me in those times, and I can go to him, but he also puts people in my life to help me walk that out. And then, of course, he's put us together to walk it out, and we have over and over made the commitment to say, this is hard, but I've put in this effort and commitment. And so not having that as ever an option, we don't go there.
Yeah. It gets hard. It gets really hard sometimes. But even in the hardest of times, we never leave any doubt as to our commitment to each other. And so while we might have some strong disagreements, and it could be heated at time, we never, ever say anything that would leave any doubt as to our commitment to each other. And that, that's not debatable. And so I think, like at the end of that verse in Deuteronomy, we don't want to be seen as detestable before the Lord. That's not what we're going to do. So let's jump forward to Matthew 19 and see where the Lord Jesus addresses this topic.
Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore what God has joined together, let man not separate." "Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery."
Yeah, so just like here in this story where Jesus is challenging them, I don't want to ever consider anything in my heart and hear the Spirit of the Lord to me say, haven't you read the Bible? Haven't you ever read what I've told you? And so, Jesus makes it very clear of what God's design was from the beginning, and how that passage in Deuteronomy was to allow for the hardness of heart in the Israelites, and made it very clear that these reasons for separating are this, and that's it. And so our encouragement is, if you're really struggling and you have this strong desire to be separated, go back to the word of the Lord and be encouraged, and get help. Find people who will encourage you in the same way. Don't surround yourself with people who will maybe tell you what you want to hear, or who are not going to advocate for you staying in commitment. And so there are people here in this church. There are hopefully people who you have surrounded yourself in your life, family members who will advocate for you, not family members who would advocate for you being separated. So find help. And I try to stress every week during this time at the end of the service that this is a time for help. There are people here to pray for you, and there are people here who care about you and want to advocate for your relationships. And so that is my encouragement, is to, if you are struggling in your commitment, then get help.
Yeah, and I would also say that there is a reason here to separate. Abuse is definitely number one on the list, but unfaithfulness definitely is abusive. And so if that's a struggle that you are having, please do us all a favor and get help, because we want to see you safe. We want to see you thriving with a relationship with Christ, and with a relationship with each other and here, and not in a dangerous situation.
Yeah, so obviously commitment can be hard, but the good news is that you and I are not the same person that we were when we first got married, and we have grown in that commitment. And at times we have leaned in deeply to reestablishing that commitment, and whether it's something super big or formal, or it's just very informal between the two of us, that we try to often renew that commitment. And so especially in times when we have struggled, we make it a point to remind each other that we are committed to each other. And so that is what I want to offer people time to do today, is encourage to stay committed to your relationships. And if you need to do some hard work to do that, and recommit yourself to each other. And that the foundation of all that is staying committed to Christ. And so, as always, we want to offer people an opportunity to commit yourself to Christ and allow him to lead you to stay committed in those relationships that he has established in your life.